After weeks of study, deliberation, and conversations with Orange County families, I've decided to support an impeachment investigation of the president.
That was California Congresswoman Katie Porter, the latest lawmaker to come out in support of an impeachment inquiry. Porter is a former law professor who narrowly flipped her district blue in last year's midterms. Her Southern California seat had been in GOP hands since its creation in 1983. Dozens of Democrats have called for an impeachment inquiry, but Congresswoman Porter is only the second freshman Democrat from a Republican-leaning district to do so. The first was Congressman Tom Malinowski of New Jersey. That comes as the Washington Post reports that Democrats are quietly airing concerns that ongoing fights with the president, including investigation of Trump and debates over impeachment, are overshadowing the party's agenda and threatening Democrats' grip on the House ahead of 2020. The Post reports that in recent weeks, Congresswoman Cheri Bustos, the chairwoman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, has briefed fellow House leaders in private meetings about focus groups the committee commissioned in 3 key political battlegrounds. The upshot, according to 4 Democrats familiar with the findings, is that the public's impression of the new House majority is bound up in its battles with Trump, not in its policy agenda. That has prompted anxiety about whether the Democratic strategy to hold the House in 2020 by focusing on health care costs and other kitchen table issues can be effective amid the president's attacks. According to those briefed on the focus groups, which were conducted earlier this year in Maine, Michigan, and Southern California, voters are largely unaware of political developments that don't involve the president. So, joining us now, member of the House Judiciary Committee, Democratic Congressman David Cicilline of Rhode Island, and co-chair of the Equality Caucus, Democratic Congresswoman Sharice Davids of Kansas. Both have voted in support of the Equality Act, which we'll get to in just a moment. Great to have you both.
Thanks for having me.
So what do you make of the news I just reported? I mean, there is this sort of friction between the concept of focusing on impeachment and the battles with Trump and looking like you're getting something done or actually getting something done.
Yeah, look, I think the Democratic caucus is completely unified on 2 points. One is to continue to deliver on the commitments we made to drive down the cost of health care, drive down the cost of prescription drugs, raise family incomes, develop a bold infrastructure plan, and take on the corruption and self-dealing in Washington and get the government working for the people. Democrats have passed almost 250 pieces of legislation. They range from 10 health care bills to equal pay for equal work to veterans' child care benefits to a tax cut for Gold Star families, universal background checks. We've delivered on that. We continue to do it. We have to communicate it to the American people. We're getting things done on their priorities.
Right.
At the same time, we have to hold this administration accountable. And we have to make sure that the president doesn't behave like he's above the law and that he's accountable for his misconduct. We have to do both things. There's been a lot of news coverage of the second part, not nearly enough on the first part. It's our responsibility in our own districts to keep communicating what we're getting done that are the urgent priorities of the American people.
So, Congresswoman, how do you break through the ground noise in these focus groups showing that if it doesn't involve Trump, a lot of Americans aren't aware of political developments?
Well, I think, first of all, it's great to be here and have the chance to talk about the Equality Act and the work that we've been doing in the House, pushing bills through and expecting the Senate to take these bills up and vote on them. And then second, I think a lot of it has to do with how we're engaging the folks at home. You know, I spend a lot of time in my district in Kansas talking to folks on the ground. We're doing town halls and holding roundtables on things like prescription drug costs and mental and behavioral health issues that our communities are facing. And I think it is incumbent upon us to make sure that we're continuing to engage with the folks who elected us and asked us to go to Washington, D.C. and represent the values of our district.
So what are you hearing back in your district when it comes to Donald Trump, impeachment versus, again, the kitchen table issues?
You know, I really am. I'm mostly just hearing about the kitchen table issues. In fact, the last time I was home, or the time before that, we did a mental and behavioral health panel where we brought in folks from across the district and various stakeholders talking about the youth and not just LGBTQ youth, but also everybody else who's impacted by issues of access to mental and behavioral health. And then I hear a lot about infrastructure. You know, the Midwest is getting hit really, really hard with these floods, and we got to make sure that we're taking care of the people at home. As somebody on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, I know how important it is to make sure that we're thinking about the infrastructure that we have to be building for our grandchildren.
So you all are both in New York for a reason. Tell us about it.
We were part of a celebration of the 50th anniversary of Stonewall for the DNC. This happens, of course, in the year that the House passed the Equality Act. And so from that very dark day, really a movement was born 50 years ago for full equality for the LGBTQ community. The House passed a comprehensive civil rights bill with the vote of every single Democrat in the House and 8 Republicans that would prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity in all areas of life. It's now sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk, along with hundreds of bills passed by Democrats, passed actually in a bipartisan way in the House. That's the interesting thing. Of those more than 250 bills, or just about 250 bills, every one of them was bipartisan, with the exception of H.R. 1, this major ethics reform, which not a single Republican voted for.
So how do you get past
sitting
that?
there.
I know. How do you get past that, and how do you not make the connection that a lot of that actually has to do with the other issue, the president?
Well, that's right. I mean, the president also has the ability to be advocating for legislation that we pass that will drive down health care costs, that would protect coverage for pre-existing conditions, that would raise family incomes. He's not going to do that.
Right.
So at some point, the American people are going to decide, look, if we like all the things that Democrats passed in the House and we want them to become reality, we have to change the composition of the Senate and elect a new president.
And at the end of the day, Mitch McConnell doesn't answer to the president. He answers to the people of his constituency. And I think that they should be putting pressure on Mitch McConnell to make sure that they're doing their jobs and voting on these bills.
So putting aside the stalled nature of the Equality Act, I think it's fair to say that the gay rights movement has probably been one of the most successful advocacy communities and movements in my generation, at least. What are the lessons as politicians that you've taken from their successes in changing public opinion that you hope to apply not just to continuing to push LGBTQ legislation, but progressive legislation writ large?
Well,
Go for it, Connie.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think that one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that, by and large, when we look at LGBTQ issues, I mean, even Stonewall was started by, you know, a group of Black trans and activists, and I think that a lot of what we're seeing in this movement is people who are taking a step back, and now as folks who sit in decision-making positions, it's our job to make sure that we're listening to every aspect of not just the LGBTQ community, but communities that have often been left out of the conversation. And what we need to think about is that our job is to listen and make decisions. Right. And I think as many people in Congress as we can get doing that, the better off we're going to be, and the Equality Act is evidence of that.
Congresswoman Sharice Davids and Congressman David Cicilline, thank you both for coming on the show.
Thank you for coming.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Hope you come back.
Everything you do. Coming up, former Daily Show host Jon Stewart gave an impassioned speech on Capitol Hill last week on behalf of 9/11 first responders. Last night, he was back at it after Mitch McConnell called him bent out of shape. We'll show you what they both had to say.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.